Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Helen Brooks. I'm a reader in Theatre and Cultural History in the School of Arts here at the University of Kent, and my current research topic is the theatre and the plays which were written and performed during and immediately after the First World War. And that means I spend a lot of my time digging into historic archives, both online and physical archives. And today, what I want to share with you is something really unexpected and I think quite fascinating that I found on one of these archival digs. And that's a series of rather gruesome horror plays which took place in the summer of 1915. So that's almost 2 years into the First World War. And these plays were performed by the celebrated Parisian Grand Guignol company. Now, the Grand Guignol was very well established by this point, but when it came to wartime London, as we'll see from the reviews, the critics were not particularly impressed. Now, the first review I came across of this productions was published in the People newspaper on the 20th of June 1915. So that's right at the end of the first week of the Grand Guignol's run. And it discussed the very first of these horror plays to be performed, and that was a play called Baie De La Nuit. Now, this was a 1912 play, so it predates the war, and it was written by Maurice Lavelle, and it culminates in an incredibly gruesome vitriol, which is like an acid attack on a young woman. The reviewer in the newspaper wrote that this is one of the most revolting plays ever seen in London. It is difficult to place the relation of this ghastly piece of work to art, and still more difficult to imagine that audiences really enjoy such an exhibition of devilish violence and realism. So it's quite a scathing review, I think. And this critic was not alone in feeling this way. On exactly the same day, the critic in the Sunday Times wrote in a similar vein that the play was so horribly horrible in these times of war when many hearts are bleeding that I refrain from comment. And they added, importantly, I have no doubt that our enlightened censors will stop such harrowing and repellent business. Now, in fact, the censor did not stop the play at all, but we can see from their correspondence and the correspondence relating to this season of plays that the men who were responsible for censoring theatre at this time felt pretty much the same way as the critics felt. So George Street was one of the two examiners of plays, and it was his job to read every play that was going to be produced in a British theatre. So under the 1843 Theatres Act, any play that was going to be performed, right up until 1968, had to get a licence from the Lord Chamberlain. And George Street was one of the Lord Chamberlain's examiners, so he would read these plays and then give advice to Viscount Sandhurst, the Lord Chamberlain, as to whether or not the play should be performed. So on the 22nd of June 1915, one of these Grand Guignol horror plays lands on George Street's desk. This one is also by Maurice Lavelle, and with Etienne Ray in this case, and it's a play called Sulla, Lumiere, Rouge, Under the Red Light. And George Street writes, this is another horrible play. It is almost incredible that in such dreadful times as these, there can be any demand for such artificial horrors. And this, I think, is the really interesting point. For Street, as for the other two critics that I've quoted, it was impossible to imagine that there would be any audience demand for plays like these, not just because they were lowbrow in their eyes and ghastly pieces of work that could hardly be called art, but most importantly because of the context in which these plays were being performed, of the context of the war. And it's this question of audience demand for these plays that I want to interrogate here, because despite the scathing critical reviews, these plays were, in fact, incredibly popular. In fact, once the initial run of the Grand Guignol had finished at the Coronet, which is in Notting Hill, once that had come to an end on the 10th of July 1915, the whole company was immediately transferred to the West End, to the Garrick Theatre just off Leicester Square, and it performed there for another month until the end of the season on the 21st of August. Altogether, the company gave 73 performances of 23 plays to packed houses, so really popular. But why, we might ask, did these wartime audiences want to see and experience theatrical horrors? Why were these plays so popular? Well, to answer this question, I want to look at those two plays which received such scathing reviews from the theatrical elite, from these critics. And doing so, as I hope you'll see, we can begin to see that their popularity was not in fact in spite of the wartime context, but was rather because of the new resonances that the war gave these plays. So let's start by looking at the first of these plays, the first horror play of the entire Grand Guignol season, a play called Baie De La Nuit. And this was a play that was so successful that it was kept on unexpectedly for a second week in the run. The play features Henri, a man who has been hideously disfigured and blinded in a vitriol attack by his jilted lover, Jean. Now, in the play, Henri invites Jean to visit him so that he can then be revenged on her by throwing vitriol in her face at the end of the play. Now, for French audiences in 1912, seeing the play for the first time, this was the moment that brought the play to a close, where it climaxed. And you can see that moment in this photo here from the 1930s production of the play. For English audiences in 1915, however, George Street, the examiner of plays, insisted that the curtain had to fall before the final attack was realised. He said that such a brutal and shocking horror would not be allowed on the English stage. Now, in identifying this moment as the moment of horror in the play, I think Street got it wrong. For wartime audiences, at a time when men are returning from the front with facial wounds and injuries just like those presented by Henri and embodied by Henri in the play, the horror was not this final moment of his attack on Jean, but rather in the figure of Henri himself. Henri is a man who has been transformed mentally, physically, and psychologically through his facial disfigurement. And as such, I would argue, he exposes the social anxieties that surrounded the physical and the mental transformation of men with these kinds of injuries, and the mixture of pity and horror which people felt towards these war-wounded men. And we can get a sense of that from this extract from Ward Muir, who was an orderly at the 3rd London General Hospital and who had seen all sorts of different injuries, but wrote in his reflections of the unique embarrassment that he felt in dealing with men with such injuries to their faces. And he wrote, "Hideous is the only word for these smashed faces, the socket with some twisted, moist slit, with a lash or two adhering feebly, the skewed mouth, and worse, far worse, the incredible brutalizing effects which are the consequence of wounds in the nose, and which reach a climax of mournful grotesquerie when the nose is missing altogether." It's a description, I think, which could very easily be applied to our victim monster Henri in Baie De La Nuit. And interestingly, I think audiences at the time realised this as well, because in 1920, an adaptation of the play was made by H.F. Maltby, and in this adaptation, the character of Henri is actually turned literally into a facially disfigured veteran. And in this play, his revenge is actually provoked by the experience of being shunned and pitied by society, and in particular by the women who had promised to love and to cherish him if he went off to be a soldier. So we can see that very direct reference to the victim monster. The way in which horror plays could tap into wartime anxieties is also evident, I think, in Sulla, Lumiere, Rouge, which premiered a few weeks later at the Coronet. Now, this is also a pre-war play. This dates from 1911. And in this play, Philippe's lover, an actress, has just died of the flu. And Philippe feels an intense desire to take a deathbed photo of her so that he can remember her as he saw her, because all the other photos he has of her are of her in different roles that she's played, so he wants a photo just of her. So he does this. And the next scene is the day after the funeral. And in this scene, obsessed with developing this photo so that he can see her once again, he does so, and he realises that her eyes are open in the photo. And he realises that, in fact, she was not dead at all. She had simply been in a trance. The final scene of the play takes place in a room adjoining the cemetery where Philippe's best friend Didier, who refuses to let Philippe go to see the opening of the coffin, goes there in his place, and he sees the coffin opened with the body with bloodied rip nails covered in blood, showing the failed attempt to escape the living death. Just like in Baie De La Nuit, here the theme of the play, being buried alive, is a theme which resonates with people throughout time, we might say. But it takes on a new resonance in this wartime context, not least for any soldiers who'd seen action on the Western Front, where being buried alive was a very real risk, as we can see in the diary of the war poet, Captain Arthur Graham West. West described in his diary the experience of searching for men buried in shell explosions when he wrote on the 20th of September 1916, 2 men were buried, perhaps more you were told, certainly 2. You dug furiously, no sign. Perhaps you were standing on a couple of men now, pressing the life out of them, on their faces or their chests. You dig and scratch and uncover a grey, dirty face. Perhaps the man is alive and kicks feebly, frantically as you unbury him. Anyhow, here is the first, and God knows how many are now beneath him. At last you get them out. 3 dead, grey, muddy masses, and 1 jabbering live one. Then another shell falls, and more are buried. It is noticeable that only 1 man was wounded, 6 were buried alive. So you get a sense from that account of the horror and also the ubiquity of being buried alive on the Western Front. But whilst the horror of this play resonates with contemporary fears over the kinds of death that men were experiencing on the battlefields, Sulla, Lumiere, Rouge is also a play about the experience of loss and grief. Throughout the play, it is Philippe, the mourner, who we're aligned with as an audience. And it is in Philippe's articulation of his bereavement that the play taps into this ultimate wartime anxiety. He says in the play, "You can't imagine how quickly the dead leave us. She's fading away, fading away. Her eyes, her mouth, her expression, it all eludes me. It's like being bereaved all over again. 1 minute she's there in front of me and then suddenly she's vanished. No, that's not what I want. This void, this darkness, it's horrible." So although the gruesomeness of Thérèse being buried alive is the moment of horror in the play, for me, it's this moment, this ultimate expression of bleak, black void of grief, which is the most troubling and I think the most resonant perhaps for audiences at the time. And I think it's hard not to think, whilst hearing those words, of all those in the audience who had been bereaved, of those men who had seen their friends killed on the battlefield, disappearing in a moment, or of all of those who sat in the audience who feared that a precious photo of their loved one, perhaps a photo taken in uniform before their loved one went off to enlist, that would be all they ever saw of them again. And thinking about how moments like this might have resonated for audiences living through the war might perhaps get us to ask again, like those critics I began with, why would men and women experiencing the real-life horrors of war, why would they have wanted to go to the theatre to experience the fictional horrors of the Grand Guignol? Well, the answer is that we need to remember that these plays were not about the war. They simply resonated with the experience of it. And as such, they provided, to draw on horror theorist Joseph Grixty, a safely distanced and stylised means of making sense of and coming to terms with phenomenon and potentialities of experience which under normal circumstances would be found too threatening and disturbing. So ultimately then, I would argue that the Grand Guignol was not popular in spite of the realities of war, but because of them. And because for a very short time sitting in that theatre, those audiences were provided with a safe, fictional space with which to explore and perhaps even mediate to an extent the unprecedented horror and uncertainty of the world around them. Thank you.